through the next panel. Thank you.
We're going to get started on our next panel, and I'm going to maximize our time. I'm going to start talking while our panelists come up here, and they're going to sit in a location and move the microphones around so that each of them has a microphone in front of themselves. Now, this next session is really an overview session on the topic of public acceptance. We're going to have 4 different panelists here who have differing perspectives, differing experiences with real projects in real communities. We're going to stipulate from the beginning that there's clearly some places where wind should not be developed in New England and some other places where it makes sense. We'll stipulate at the beginning that there are some ways that are effective in terms of seeking out public support, public acceptance, public feedback, and there are some strategies that turn out not to be so successful in terms of getting public input. Our task here is to figure out, well, what's the distinction? How do you decide between appropriate places for wind development and inappropriate places? How do you best structure support for wind energy and input on wind energy in ways that make sense, and how do you avoid the ways that don't make sense? The way we're going to do this panel is that we're going to start with some short presentations. Each speaker has taken a blood oath that they will speak for no more than 5 minutes to introduce themselves and their experiences in terms of real projects in real places here in New England. After that, we're going to have a moderated discussion where I'm going to ask the panelists some questions for about a half hour to expand on some of the things they've been talking about in their introductions. We're then going to turn it over to your questions, and as Bob mentioned before, write your questions on the card, pass them to the aisles, and we will take the questions and ask them of the panelists. Their bios are in the packet, so I'm not going to go over them, but I will say a couple of things about the panelists as a group. First of all, they have different perspectives. They don't all agree with each other on everything, but they have 3 things in common. They're all extremely articulate, they're all very smart, and they all have a lot of useful experience and relevant experience with wind projects and their development in real places here in New England. We have 4 speakers, and I will talk about each of them in order. We're going to start with Suzanne Pude, who is the Community Energy Director at the Island Institute in Rockland, Maine, and she's going to tell you for 5 minutes something about her experiences with a wind project there.
Thanks, Warren. Thanks for the introduction. I'll try to live up to it and not talk for much longer than 5 minutes. I think what I'm going to try to do is just give you a quick little bit of background on the Island Institute where I work, because our relationship is a little bit unique in this setting, and then I'll go in to give you some context on the Fox Islands Wind Project. I know some of you have heard bits and pieces of it about it already, but I'll try to give you the background on it. So as Warren said, I'm the Community Energy Director at the Island Institute. We are a nonprofit organization based up in Rockland, Maine, a couple hours up the coast past Portland. We've been around for 28 years now, partnering with Maine's year-round island and coastal communities to help them remain what we consider vibrant places to live and work. What that means is that we're partnering with communities on a host of different issues, ranging from affordable housing to fisheries policy, and now even more on energy issues. Many of the communities we work with pay between 3 and more than 8 times the national average for their electricity rates, and pay extremely high costs for heating oil because of the added cost of transporting the oil to the islands. So the islands are paying high electric rates because of the need to finance submarine cables to bring electricity out to them, or the fact that they are generating their own power with diesel fuel on the islands. We have Matinicus and Manhegan paying about 60 and 70 cents a kilowatt hour for their power right now. We've got a gentleman here in the room from Swans Island in Maine who's paying just over 30 cents right now for their power through their cable. So it's obviously a serious issue for the viability of the communities that we work with, for homeowners and business owners to make ends meet. And so starting in about 2007, we began to hear requests from the islands for the Island Institute to provide some support to them to look at alternatives and ways to reduce those high costs. There was particular interest in wind power because if you live on the coast, and particularly on the islands, you know there's a lot of wind, and it seemed like there was some possibilities there. So at that time in 2007, 2008 is when the Island Institute was asked to participate in helping the Fox Islands community to consider the possibility for wind power out there. And so I guess I'll move into Fox Islands Wind. Fox Islands Wind is a 4.5 megawatt community-owned wind project. It's made up of 3 GE 1.5 megawatt turbines, and it's sited on the island of Vinalhaven. Vinalhaven is one of the 2 Fox Islands. Vinalhaven to the south has roughly 1,200 year-round residents. It's a pretty blue-collar working-class community. I think it holds the highest number of lobster licenses in the state of Maine, so that's a big deal where I'm from. Just to the north of Vinalhaven, across what we call the Fox Islands Thoroughfare, a small strip of water, is the community of North Haven, about 300 year-round residents out there. Both of those communities are connected to each other and to the mainland by an 11-mile submarine cable, which in 2007, 2008, when we started talking to them, they were paying about 28, 29 cents a kilowatt hour for their power. But the Fox Islands Wind Project discussion on the possibility for wind started back in around 2000, 2001, when the co-op general manager gave a call to the UMass Renewable Energy Lab folks. They sited a Met Tower on the second highest hill of the island, and 3 years later found out that they had a commercially viable wind resource out there. Discussion then turned to the possibility of someone coming from off island, someone from away, that's a big deal in Maine, coming and trying to develop that project, and concerns about how that would work. And so a few years later, when the land where the turbines are sited came up for sale, a couple of local year-round residents with the resources went ahead and purchased that site with the hopes that someday they could see community wind developed there. Fast forward through Hurricane Katrina, there was a lot of volatility in electric prices, and it was really tough for people to budget out there, and it was sort of a crisis at that time. And that's when the Island Institute became involved. There were questions about, if we have this wind resource and we have an interest in doing this, how do we make it happen? And the 2 most important things, creating local benefit through reduced electric rates and local ownership and control, were things that, with the current way of financing projects, would be difficult to achieve. With my colleague George Baker taking sabbatical from the Harvard Business School, we were able to develop a financing and ownership structure that enabled both of those things to actually happen, the local ownership and benefit. And spent a lot of time talking with the community for about 9 months or so about the feasibility of the project, taking questions, hearing concerns, doing research, and trying to get their input. In July of 2008, the electric cooperative, both seasonal and year-round members of the communities, took a vote, and that vote was a pretty clear mandate to move forward with the project. It was 382 to 5 were in favor of developing a project. At that point, things moved quickly. The ground broke on the project in early June 2009, and by mid-November 2009, we have 500 or so folks out in the middle of Vinalhaven. We had to barge school buses out there to just move people on the island, and we were able to start the project up. We are about a year and a half into the project. Since the 2 big pieces there that we'll talk more about today, one is that the exciting thing is that the project is working. It's produced more power than originally projected and lowered rates by about 15%. And I think what we're here to talk about today is public acceptance. And 9 months into the project, we helped the electric cooperative put out a survey of its members, a pretty good turnout response from the surveys. And what that told us was that the project, 95% of the community said they were either as supportive or more supportive of the project now that it's in operation, whereas 5% of the community said that they were now less supportive of the project. So there are a lot of pieces in there, and I look forward to Warren's questions and your questions to dig deeper in that.
Great. Thank you very much, Suzanne. Our next speaker is not on your list. It was originally going to be a gentleman named Michael Sklar was on the program, but we're very fortunate because Michael couldn't be here to have Jonathan Fitch with us, who has an excellent experience as the manager of the Princeton Municipal Light Department, and he's going to talk about his experiences there and the issues of public acceptance in that community. Jonathan.
All right. Thank you, Warren. My name is John, and I manage the Princeton Light Department in Princeton, Massachusetts. We began our wind farm experience back in 1984, and it was all based upon our ratepayer customer desire to have a large percentage of their energy portfolio coming from a renewable resource. So we started off with a large public acceptance of a project like this. In 84, we put in the 10 very small wind turbines. In about 2001, we figured out that they're at the end of their life. In 2001 through 2003, we had a public discussion, many public forums and hearings about whether or not to redevelop that site. And what we came up with in 2003 was a 2-turbine, 3-megawatt site, basically two 1.5 megawatt turbines, sited on the same site that the original turbines were located. We went out to public hearings, ended up with a public vote, which overwhelmingly supported the project. And we presented it to our ratepayers that it would at least stabilize our rates. We didn't think it would reduce our public or our electric rates, but at least stabilize them over the long term. That vote was very successful. From there, we went through site plan review twice, got 2 permits twice, got sued multiple times. From 2003 to 2009, we finally ended the entire permitting process with a site plan review at the energy siting facility and got a complete zoning bylaw exemption. Even after getting the zoning bylaws changed in our favor, we'd have felt that let's just cut to the chase and get an exemption and get this project built because our community wanted it, they accepted it, and they quite frankly, without them, we would never have built it in the first place. But anyways, in January of 2010, they were finally installed. The 2 turbines are up and operational now for almost a year and a half. They're producing at or near what we expected. Actually, in the first year of production, there was a slightly less. It looks like the first year kinks have been worked out, and it has been nonstop operational for the last 6 months. So we're very happy with the turbines. They are producing what we expected, and we're very happy with the results so far. So that's where we come from. It was a very long process. Even with a community like ours where we had existing turbines, it took a long time to get it permitted. Actually, I should correct that. It took only a few months to get it permitted. Once it was challenged, that's what caused the delays. And like I said, it went on from 2003 to 2009 before we finally started construction on our project. The public acceptance in our community, again, is extremely high. It still is today. I get comments all over. We have tours up there nonstop. In fact, I probably have 2 or 3 tours next week as the school year ends. Everybody wants to get a field trip in, and we do hundreds and hundreds of students from all around the region coming through and looking at renewable energy in action, and it actually works in our community. So I'll keep my speech short, and I'll go to questions later on, Warren. So thank you.
Thank you, John. For those folks in the back, just to let you know, there are some seats up front on this side and in the middle area here if you want to have a seat. Our next speaker is Christopher Senie. He's an attorney with a private practice here in Westboro. He's in the last year or two, he's represented neighbors who have been concerned about wind projects in a number of communities, and he's going to do his 5-minute introduction now.
Thank you, Warren. I thank the New England Wind Energy Education Project for inviting me to sit on this panel, which is an honor. I live only 2 towns over in Westboro, but I've traveled a lot down toward the Cape over the past year, representing a number of neighborhood or community groups concerned, in one case, about existing turbines, and in about 7 or 8 cases about planned turbines. Some of my clients are here in the room, and it's good to see them. In terms of municipal projects, I mean turbine projects that are owned by a town or some cooperative utility company, I've represented neighbors in Falmouth, Brewster, Dartmouth, and Ashburnham. And in terms of private turbine developers, I've represented neighborhood groups with concerns in Marion, Wareham, Bourne, Plymouth, and Charlton. And for the most part, I think the process before the local boards with the private turbine projects is going better. I think the processes at Town Hall have been undertaken more deliberately and in a more balanced fashion. I think there is a robust discussion that the land use process is aimed at having in front of a planning board or zoning board of appeals or board of selectmen. And those are going fairly well. I think the developers in those cases would say that they are discouraged because the neighborhood opposition or community opposition has resulted in some modifications of their projects. In Wareham, for example, a privately sponsored 8-turbine project with large industrial-scale turbines was tapered back to 6 and then down to 2, and those 2 are now the size of the Falmouth, existing turbines in Falmouth, and those actually will meet a new emerging compromise setback tool that the Cape Cod Commission has arrived at, which is a setback distance, a rebuttable presumption setback distance of 10 times rotor diameter. So the developer in Wareham is disappointed to have lost so many opportunities to create more energy, but I think through an open and fair and balanced land use process, we are arriving at something that will fit better. By the way, just as an aside, I think the challenge that we think we're facing is how to site these turbines better. I happen to believe that we can put wind turbines on almost any property. It's a question of having the right sizing tool. Turbines come in many shapes and sizes. I think the technology will change over the next decade or two. And I think when we talk about large horizontal access turbines, which are basically big fan blades, we need to be careful to site those by use of a sizing tool to make sure that if a community-sized turbine, such as Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute's turbine, which is about 165 feet tall, fits, that we aren't trying to put what I call Texas Panhandle-sized turbine on that site. And to agree with me, you would have to agree that there are some negative impacts. The one that I concentrate on almost exclusively is the noise impact to neighbors who are living too adjacent to the larger turbines. In Bourne, again, there was a 6-turbine project privately sponsored along the canal at Cape Cod, recently tapered back to 4 turbines. So 2 have been dropped. Those 2 were the closest to the neighbors who are my clients and who were concerned. I will note that with the town-owned or municipal-owned turbines, there are some problems happening at Town Hall, and we should be careful about this. And I see that I have 1 minute. I'm happy to go into more detail. But towns have a conflict of interest. On the one hand, they wear the hat of the Alternative Energy Committee, which is trying to encourage the deployment of wind turbines and the use of wind energy, but at other moments they wear the hat of the regulatory agencies that are reviewing the projects. And there, I must say, in 30 years of land use practice, I have never seen such contention or such tension between municipal boards and their citizens, and I think we need to be especially focused on and sensitive to the conflict that exists when a municipality is both the regulatory agency and the owner of the 2 turbines. I'll stop here, but I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Chris. And our last speaker is Dylan Voorhees, who's director of the Clean Energy Project at the National Natural Resources Council of Maine.
Thank you, Warren, and thank you for having me, and thank you also very much to folks who put this conference together. We're very supportive of the effort. The Natural Resources Council of Maine is Maine's largest environmental advocacy organization. We work in lots of different environmental areas. I direct our clean energy work. We also do traditional environmental advocacy around wildlife and water quality, and importantly in Maine, protection of the Great North Woods. We've been very involved in wind power policy in Maine and also in many projects. There are 10 or 12 fairly large-scale projects that we've been involved in some degree, and we're knowledgeable of another 3, 4, or 5 of them in the state. And I have a lot of thoughts and conclusions about siting policy itself. I'm going to try and not talk about that and really focus on public acceptance. For NRCM, we're supportive of wind power, quite supportive of wind power because of our need to reduce our dependence on fossil fuels and reduce pollution. At the same time, our organization, which has celebrated its 50th anniversary last year, has a long tradition of land conservation and protecting the North Woods. And so it really, for us, is about this balance between clean energy and protection of some very unique resources in the eastern part of the United States. Some general background on public acceptance of wind in Maine. Wind power remains very popular, receives a lot of general support. We and others have polled the citizens of Maine many times over the last several years, and public support for should Maine have more wind power remains very high, 80% support. And that comes from a background of wanting to reduce our dependence on fossil fuels. Maine has a long history of jobs and economy that is based on use of natural resources. And this can fit on that. And of course, it is for Maine a source of very significant economic investments and jobs and the like. There are several of those projects. Many of those projects have been contentious. And I think there's evolving, something of a dialogue in Maine, perhaps a pushback against some of that development. Again, public opinion remains very supportive. Well, what happens when you go to a specific project in that context? And I think what we've observed is that public acceptance of projects, and again, the projects that I'm familiar with, and as you saw from the maps, Maine is familiar with, are large-scale utility projects. There are a couple of projects that are a little bit different scale, and obviously Suzanne's talked about really a special project for Maine, a large-scale community project. But what I'm talking about are generally commercial utility wind farms. And the public acceptance, when you get from a broad question, do you support wind power, down to a specific, really hinges on the local public's understanding of the trade-offs between wind. And we agree with others here and perhaps everybody here, there are trade-offs. And so it depends on the local public's understanding of those trade-offs. Does it reduce pollution? How will it benefit me as an electric ratepayer if it's just going onto the grid? What about noise? And I think noise issues, as well as issues that might be summarized as quality of place issues for Maine, I think have risen to the top. And in a lot of cases, those very complex issues get boiled down to some very simple principles that may trump a lot of the complexity. The permitting and development process in Maine, I think, is a relatively good one. It's very important. We see that there are kind of third-party validators who can help decision makers and the public sort through and kind of shed the extreme assertions that are made pro and against wind. And we think people, including developers, should really embrace that process. And it might take a year, it might take more, but it's really an important process. It seems to be working, and a lot of the projects really have been permitted. Finally, just as a general matter, I think municipal governments, we can talk a little bit more about this in Maine, again, not in the case where municipalities are themselves proposing projects. That's not generally the case. Municipal governments can play a very constructive and positive role in helping towns and local people come to terms with those trade-offs, understand them. And in the best cases, we've seen local government really put together committees and have a structured process that is independent from the wind developer, perhaps with financial support from them, but allows the municipality to really dive into this. And this obviously is more feasible when you have 50, 100 megawatt or tens of megawatt projects. But maybe we can talk a little bit more about that. We've certainly seen some challenges on local acceptance in Maine, but there's some really good practices as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Dylan. So now I'm going to ask some questions of the panelists for a little while, and then we'll take questions from the audience. I'm going to jump around between the panelists. I'm going to start with a couple questions for Suzanne. You mentioned in the Fox Island project that when a survey was taken, the majority of folks at the moment seem to support the project, but can you break it down? Are there different groups in the community who have different views of this project, or can you not generalize about who supports it, who doesn't, and so on?
Sure. I think, is this on? This one's not on. It's this one. Okay. You're right. It's tough to generalize, particularly in my position. We try not to speak for islanders and generalize islanders, but I think that survey does give you a lot of good information. It is available online at our website, foxislandswind.com, and I have a couple of copies here if anyone's really interested in it. But what we've seen through both that original vote from the electric cooperative membership in 2008 and the survey that went out last year around this time, we had pretty good feedback from both seasonal and year-round residents. In an island community, that's really important to make sure that seasonal residents who pay taxes and pay their utility bills and everything all year round but might not be there are not feeling disenfranchised. So that's been an important piece. So just so to be clear that those numbers do reflect feedback from both year-round and seasonal residents. Overall, I think that some of the things that have been interesting with what's resonated with the community out there across the board, not so much the sort of environmental benefit that we talk about a lot with renewable energy, but more the idea of the economic savings and this whole idea of sort of self-reliance and energy independence. The project generates, I'm not sure if I said this earlier, generates just a little bit more than what the islands use over the course of the year, and it was designed specifically to do that, to sort of insulate it from the mainland energy markets. And so I think that those two ideas have really where we've seen support across the board, perhaps because of the nature of the community being a little bit more focused on their pocketbook or their wallet than necessarily the environmental sort of do-gooder sort of things. There's a lot of pride in the fact that we did this ourselves. We all do different things in the island. We come from different places, but we did this together. But certainly, obviously, we've heard about the fact that there are some folks that are not happy with this project. They've been in the newspaper. They've shared their thoughts in the survey as well. And we've heard a lot of concerns expressed from these few folks that live around the project about the noise. We've had people question whether or not people's rates have actually gone down or not, which seems straightforward, but some people, it's not straightforward for them. And some questions about sort of the management structure. This is a project that is essentially run by the local electric cooperative, but for purposes of the tax credits, we had to set up a separate LLC. So those are some of the things that we're hearing from other folks about concerns about the project.
Great. And based on your experience in Maine and with that project, do you have any advice for folks in other municipalities across the region about how to approach interacting with the public about wind projects?
Sure. As somebody said earlier, every project's going to be different. Every community is different. We work with some pretty unique communities that have pretty unique energy needs. And so I think that the high prices is really what drove a lot of what we were doing. But certainly it's been a priority for us to engage the community throughout the process. to give them a say. I mean, that vote in 2008 essentially gave the community veto power to say, do we want to do this or do we not want to do this? It's been important to try to give information as objectively as we can so that the community, who is essentially the owner of the project, really feels like they have the information that they need about any of the challenges that the project's confronting or any of the additional opportunities that have come about as a result. So yeah, early often, that's what they always say, giving some real power to the communities. And I think what we've really tried to do is think outside the box a little bit and say, where are the resources around us to help answer these questions, to help address these concerns, and we've been able to pull together some really interesting partnerships to try to do that. So I think look beyond sort of your traditional tool set and see where else you can find some resources to help you engage with the community.
Good. And Chris, when we were preparing for this session, you talked about your experience in a number of different communities and say that you feel that the neighbors feel better about the way it's gone in some communities than others, and you have said you felt pretty good about the spirit of cooperation and the way things have been handled in the town of Falmouth when some serious concerns were raised. Why do you think things have gone well there, and what are the lessons you can draw from that for what should be done in other towns?
Thank you, Warren. I think Falmouth is a great community. It's a town that's willing to try new things. They actually adopted a wind turbine bylaw in 1981, so they were quite visionary. In preparing what we call Wind 1 and Wind 2, which are located at the town's wastewater treatment facility, the town said to the public, we will come in for a special permit, which the bylaws require unless the town wants to take the position that, no, it's like any other municipal use, like a police station or a school, so we don't need to. But as they got closer to getting ready to build 1 and 2, somehow the decision was made to skip the special permit process. And there are 2 reasons why every single municipality with every single turbine should have a special permit public hearing process and allow open dialogue. One is that you get a better end product, because these boards are very good. They're not paid and they volunteer, but they listen. And often when a special permit is granted, that board can attach conditions that will safeguard the community. The other is that members of the community feel that they had a chance to say their piece. They participated openly. They were allowed to stand at a microphone and ask questions. And their fellow citizens who sit on a planning board or zoning board of appeals listened. And communities reconcile themselves and neighborhoods reconcile themselves to their new structure in the neighborhood better if they've had that opportunity. And we have a number of communities in Massachusetts that have tried to circumvent that process, and I named those. I don't know how the decision was made in Falmouth to skip the special permit, but it has led to after the fact acoustical studies and debates. And that's a shame, because this is $10 million worth of hardware that have a 20-year lifespan. They're about 1 year into that lifespan. And there are neighbors that are within 1,300, 1,500, 2,000 feet who are having distress. Now, I did say, Warren, that I was proud of Falmouth, and I think that they responded well in this respect. And I'm very proud of the Falmouth Board of Selectmen. They listened to my clients, some of whom are here, and they voluntarily imposed on Wind 1, which is the only one of their 2 turbines that's actually producing electricity so far, a noise mitigation measure, and it cuts off every time the wind exceeds 10 meters per second, which is 23 miles per hour. And that provides my clients with some significant relief. Not all of the distressing sound has gone away. And Falmouth is losing money. Here's a turbine that's supposed to make $120,000 a year in either avoided electricity costs or cash through net metering that is now losing about as much money per year. Now, they're probably going to come out okay because they have a second turbine which they basically got for free. And once we shake this out, which will take another 6 months, I think those 2 turbines will definitely have a permit of some sort that's going to require them to re-up their permit every 3 years, a maximum 20-year life after which they should come down, and some protocol to test the noise to make sure we keep it within that range. And I think that's the best we're going to do. I told my clients at Falmouth we're not going to remove those turbines. But I will say I'm proud of the Board of Selectmen. I'm proud of the Board of Health in Falmouth. They've worked very hard to try to bridge the gap on a project that just got by everyone. The technology 5 years ago when that was, or our understanding of the technology was not where it is today. So I do feel that it was wrong to skip that process, and at any time the town can submit to that process, which it should, and I think that will eventually happen.
And Chris, when you were talking before in your opening remarks, you expressed real concern and skepticism about municipalities both being in the role of developer and regulator of wind projects. Does that mean you think that municipalities should never be the developer and owner of a wind project, or do you think there are some ways they could do it that would be successful?
I definitely think municipalities should take on the challenge of owning solar, geothermal, and wind installations to try to increase our use of renewable energy or decrease the amount of electricity that a town takes from the grid, which is just as good as putting electricity into the grid. The problem is that the turbines we've all chosen, every project that I mentioned to you, are the really big projects. These are the largest turbines on the East Coast that are being proposed in Plymouth, Bourne, Wareham. These are 100 meters to the hub and then a 100-meter circle, which is very large, of the swept area. So I think that communities should look at Woods Hole-sized wind turbines, which is what I would call a community-sized turbine, about 100 kilowatt turbine, or 200, 220, something in that range. Install them at a cost far less than the cost of these mega turbines, and use that 200, 300, 400 kilowatt hours a year to offset energy costs. I think towns can do that at town hall, at schools, at other buildings. I think for some reason we all got so excited about this that we jumped over about a dozen different sizes of turbines and went right to the really, really large ones. And when you do that, you create a certain type of sound pressure that comes once a second, and it is very distressing to the residents.
And Jonathan, you're in a situation where you, in effect, were a municipal developer of wind turbines. Do you have any advice for other municipalities about how municipalities can develop wind turbines in a way that will achieve public acceptance? And also, do you think there are situations where it's possible for municipalities to install larger megawatt-plus size turbines, or do you agree with Chris that it's better for municipalities to stay with the smaller ones?
Well, it's important to note that the Princeton Municipal Light Department is a separate government agency, essentially, separate from the town, and that it has its own elected board of light commissioners, and they're directly in charge of setting rates and running the utility company. And we had to go through the same process as any other private developer in town. So we still had to go through the permitting process. We had to go through a site plan review, in fact, multiple site plan reviews. But nonetheless, we did it. And we also voluntarily went through the MEPA process. So we kept getting hit from some of the small amount of opponents that we had to our project, that we were exempt somewhat from some of these processes. And we kept saying, no, we're not. And we're going to go through them, and we're going to go through even more so I could take that fight away. Specifically, the MEPA process I mentioned. We'll go through that. Our project doesn't trigger any of the thresholds, but we feel confident that we'll go through it. But I'd like to point out in our project, we had a decided majority, and it was talked about earlier in the introduction of this whole conference that there's an undecided majority. Well, in our case, there was a decided majority that said we want this particular project installed in Princeton, and we'd like the Princeton Light Department to put it up. But it's important to note, I think it was mentioned even by a couple of the panelists so far, that no project is perfect, and that you need to communicate what those imperfections are. It's going to create noise. You're going to see it, whether it's 100 meters or 65 meters. It doesn't matter at that scale. It's massive. You're going to see it for quite some distance. It might impact avian life. It might kill birds. Just say it. It might do it. It might create shadow flicker, but you can manage around that. You can mitigate that. And you're going to have to see it. And that's the biggest thing that we found from our both our opponents and our project supporters, that the biggest concern at the end of the day was you're going to see these turbines from some distance, from some vantage point in Princeton or even the surrounding community. And at the end of the day, through all of our surveys, our public votes, our ballot votes, and even the bylaw change that we had voted in our favor, we knew that we had the overwhelming majority of support for this project, so we went ahead with it. And like I said, it's up and running now, and it works well for us. But there is a decided majority of supporters out there in our community, so you can't lose sight of that, and that's what kept us going.
Okay. And Dylan, early on, you were talking about how there's been a range of responses to different projects in Maine. What advice or lessons do you draw from that in terms of how wind developers should approach interacting with the local communities? Has the success or failure of projects in terms of public acceptance been strictly based on the realities on the ground of those projects, or has it in part been based on how developers engaged in the civic engagement process? What's been the cause of some projects being more popular and some being less popular?
Well, that's a good question, and like most good questions, the answer is both. Some of the difference between acceptance of projects does relate to what you might try and call the sort of objective facts of the matter. How close are homes to those projects? Certainly, some of the projects where post-construction noise concerns are projects where homes have been on the closer side. I think in Maine, generally the distances are on the larger side of the distances that sounds like some folks in Massachusetts are dealing with, but some are less than 2,000 feet. So some of that just relates to the facts of that, but certainly not all of that. There have been projects that where turbines are all well more than 3,000 feet or more away from people, and still there are certainly vocal concerns that are related to noise. So it does relate also to public perceptions and engagement by developers. I think that, as I was starting to say earlier, their municipalities can help be arbiters. And in Maine, with projects of the type that I'm familiar with, state agencies, our Department of Environmental Protection or our Land Use Regulation Commission, are really the larger decision makers on permitting. In most cases, municipalities can have a role, and municipalities do not have the same level of expertise that our state agencies have, but they can. But they're closer to the communities, and so I think in the best cases, and I'll mention specifically the town of Oakfield in northern Maine, where a project, a 50 megawatt project, was permitted. There was an appeal, and that project has not been constructed yet. In fact, the developer intends to change that project to make it slightly larger scale. That project received overwhelming public support, and I think it was due largely to the role of the municipality to solicit from the developer funds for an independent attorney and an independent consultant on noise that the developer paid for but didn't control, and the town set up a wind review committee that didn't have a lot of authority but had the responsibility of holding lots of public sessions, listening to the public, and also retaining some advice from these experts about how to do wind. And I think the project was well cited also in some objective ways. But I think those activities that the municipality went through in that case were really some best practices in terms of winning public support.
Good. I'm curious in terms of, as projects you know about, in terms of any project any of you could mention, how many people live within half a mile of the project, and what percentage of the folks who live within a half a mile of that project do you think are seriously concerned about the noise from that project, and what percentage are moderately concerned, and what percentage aren't concerned? Anybody have any data in terms of any project? Chris?
I would say with all of the projects I've been involved with, people live within half a mile. And I do want to I don't want to get into acoustics here. I'm not qualified, and this isn't the purpose of this conference, but there, and some of you will disagree, but there is a stubborn, lower frequency noise that occurs as a result of these large blades cutting through winds moving at different speeds, which is called wind shear. And it is something that is extraordinarily difficult to live with if you live too close to it. I have experienced it myself. I haven't just sat in my office and worked on these cases. I have been to my clients' homes to personally experience this. So we are talking about a kind of nuisance. People who know me know that I haven't tried to learn about shadow flicker. I haven't tried to learn about avian effects. I have focused on one issue, and that issue is the amplitude modulated noise, the thumping or the swishing that at times becomes thumping. This is something that is causing a level of distress that is simply not livable if you are too close. And now I believe that, and some of you may not. Some of you may have accepted the statements that it's as quiet as a living room conversation. But I have clients here who are really suffering from some distress. And that's the only thing I focus on. For example, Dartmouth. I appeared there last night. These are two municipal wind turbines, exactly the size of the two in Falmouth, and I drew two circles around those turbines. Those circles represent, again, I mentioned earlier, this sort of compromise sizing tool that has grown out of Cape Cod. The Cape Cod Commission has adopted it, of 10 times rotor diameter, which with a Falmouth turbine would be 2,690 feet. And I realize that's a large setback, not as large as some acoustical engineers call for, but fairly large. And there were 152 homes within the two circles around the Dartmouth turbines. I represent about 25 people. They tend to be the closer ones to the turbines, but you have a community where, if we're right, that this is really distressing to people who live in that proximity, you could have an awful lot of your citizens impacted by those turbines.
Well, let me ask other folks who have experience with other projects, how many folks live within a half a mile, and what percentage of them do you think are concerned about the noise now that the project's up? This is talking about projects that are built, up and running. How about in terms of Princeton?
In Princeton, we have about half a dozen residents and one business included in that number, which is a function hall, high-end function hall for weddings. They live within about a half a mile. The closest person is one resident at 2,450 feet approximately. Of those 6, 2 were the most local opponents. And I think, I don't want to speak for them, but I think the biggest impact they felt was the aesthetics. The noise didn't come up as a bigger issue in our particular site because, quite frankly, we had 10 old turbines that ran at 77 RPMs, and that created a heck of a lot more noise than the 2 turbines we have now. So we sold it as we were improving the conditions.
It also sounds like in your Princeton site, compared to the project Chris was talking about in Dartmouth, you have relatively few people living in close proximity to the site. So right there's a difference between your existing project and some other proposed projects.
And it's rolling terrain, heavily forested, so a much bigger, or I'd like to say less impact on the noise than probably like the gentleman was saying.
And how about Fox Island?
On Vinyl Haven, we haven't done a formal census of asking people what they think across the board, but generally, so I apologize to anybody if I get the numbers wrong, but generally I think we say there are about 30 people between 3/4 of a mile and a mile. So again, it's sort of more similar to John's situation in that it's not a really densely populated area. It's mostly forested. I would say of that number, we've got maybe half that express some sort of concern, which varies between, yeah, I hear it and it bothers me every once in a while, and we have maybe 6 to 8 folks who maybe say, who've said that it's impacted them far more dramatically. And then the other half, have said vocally in the newspapers and elsewhere, that it doesn't bother them, it doesn't, create an issue at all. So I think it's been a bit of a challenge for the community to wrap its head around the fact that, some people are impacted. People are impacted so differently.
So are you saying at Fox Island there's no one who lives within 3/4 of a mile?
No. That number of 30 or so is the within 3/4 to roughly a mile.
Within 3/4 of a mile.
Yep.
Okay,
Yep.
sorry. Okay, and of that, what percentage? Do you have a sense of how many of them are under a half a mile?
I would say it's a little tough because there are seasonal residents in the mix there as well that are there sometimes and not others. But I'd say roughly half.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay. So a relatively modest number compared to some projects, but more than in Princeton. Dylan, were you going to say something?
Well, there's obviously a lot of projects in Maine that I'm familiar with, and off the top of my head, I would say there are several wind projects that are operational that may not have any people within half a mile, and there are some. Suzanne's talked about one of them, and there are probably two others where there are a couple to a dozen or 20 people in that distance. One of the things I would say is, and this is pretty imprecise, and I'm also not an acoustic expert, but my sense of the distance at which concerns about noise are likely to increase sort of significantly is probably closer to 2,000 feet than half a mile, and that's very imprecise, obviously. And one of the other things that I've observed is that people react differently. So there's a wide variety, I don't know if it's physical or psychological or what it is. There are a range of reactions, and the expectations going forward, I think, actually also matter, and that's why I would encourage developers to be very careful about overpromising the quietness or the lack of audibility of a project. And I think if you expect to hear it sometimes or to hear it a little bit, and then you do, that's probably more likely to be okay than somebody told you you're never going to hear it, and it turns out you do hear it, and that becomes a big deal. So expectations matter. And finally, I want to encourage people, a plug for NEWEEP. They did a very good webinar on this issue, and at least one or two of the presentations did some quantitative assessment of how close, how many people react, and so I encourage people to go to the website and take a close look at that.
Good. I'm going to start turning to audience questions, and I've gotten a few already, but I'll take some more. And Nils and Deborah, if you could collect some of these, or someone, I will get them. I'm going to start with a question that came in advance by mail from Annette Smith from Vermonters for a Clean Environment, and I'm going to expand on the question for all of the folks here, partially building on something Dylan just said. Well, Annette's question was for Suzanne, and she said, regarding Fox Island wind, what were people told ahead of time about the wind turbine noise, and has that turned out to be accurate, or has the reality been somewhat different? And then secondly, this is building on this, you can answer that and everybody could think about the second part, which is Dylan's piece. You have to be honest with people about what the noise is going to be. Do we think that some of the issue has been that early on folks didn't have such a good sense of what the noise issues are? Now they do, and it really is possible to make accurate predictions of what noise levels will be like and how people might respond? Or from your standpoint in terms of dealing with the public, it still is too hard to give any accurate picture of things? But first, Suzanne, your sense of Fox Island.
Thanks, Annette. I think that that's a question or a point that gets brought up by the folks in the newspapers a lot. I think I was not working on the project during the pre-development phases, but what I have been told is that there was discussion based on the acoustic reports that we had done and conversations with the manufacturer that because of its location in a pretty wooded area of the island, that the ambient noise would be higher than the noise from the turbine at many of the times that it was operating. And that I think that there was, anecdotal sort of things said from people that had gone to visit. One of the things is we'd encourage and continue to encourage people to take trips to visit other turbine sites. In Maine, there's actually one that's 3 turbines, 3 GE 1.5 turbines not far from, on the mainland side of the Fox Islands. And I think folks that went to visit that turbine came back and said, I didn't find it offensive. It really doesn't make much noise. And that sort of, went through the community. So I think that there was an expectation from some people that it wouldn't be a really big concern. And based on the data that we had and the review of the Maine DEP that, approved it, the sound modeling and gave us the permit, it was supposed to meet state regulations, which we were told was supposed to be adequate to not create concerns for people. And I think that it's important to remember that probably the same with the situation in Falmouth is that these conversations were happening 3 years ago when I think the environment and the discussions around wind was a little bit different than it is now. And so I don't think that what I was told is in those public meetings, the series of public meetings that was held, the issue of noise as a concern really wasn't raised very frequently. So it wasn't something, the technical information was shared and there wasn't really much concern. So I think that that's why it didn't necessarily get the play that a lot of communities have it, that give it at this point in time.
Thank you. And so anybody have any comments about the general question that I raised, which is the issue of, are we at the point where we can do a good job of giving people an accurate picture of what noise impacts are likely to be after a project is built or not? John and then Chris.
We have just a little bit of experience with that. We had, in our site plan review, we had a condition set that we would do a post-study if requested by some of the folks that had concerns with noise. We haven't been requested yet after a year and a half of operation, so we don't think that's going to go too far, but we're more than willing to do that noise analysis post-construction. We had one resident talk about noise, and she thought she would not be able to hear it, but she did. I said, give me a few months. We aligned the generator turbine, which was scheduled right after completion of the erection. The noise went away. She hasn't heard it since. So there's some things that went around the installation that we were able to do to make it even quieter. But the most important thing is we had a community come in and do a noise study, because they needed it for their own resident or municipality. And the numbers they came up with their meters matched fairly closely with the graphs that we were producing 3 or 4 or 5 years ago, which were more theoretical on the noise output of the proposed turbines. And so we were glad to see that the actual output was somewhat close. It wasn't I wouldn't call it a 100% scientific study, but it was something that at least made me feel comfortable that the noise output was at or near where the graph said it should be.
Okay, good. And Chris?
Just quickly, I do think it's very important for municipalities to be clear and to give good quality information and then to keep their promises. And unfortunately in Falmouth, a promise that will take it through the public permit process wasn't kept, and we have a considerable problem there. My experience in other towns where the municipality is the owner, I have found that the information has been guarded, that boards go into executive session when they really shouldn't, that people are not given a full opportunity to go up to a microphone and talk. I've even had public hearings tabled for an indefinite period of time, which is not proper. So there seems to be, with these turbine projects where the municipalities are the owner, some lack of not only the information, but of the free flow of information back and forth. The other thing I'd like to just say is that I think it's a little bit more objective than how some people may characterize whether or not neighbors are going to be distressed. The only project where there is an existing turbine that I've had experience with is in Falmouth, and I will say that that community welcomed the turbines. They knew they were coming. They thought there would be a public hearing. There wasn't, but they were still excited that at the wastewater treatment plant there would be 2 turbines. And then the percentage of people who, notwithstanding an expectation that it will be good, have found distress is much higher than you might expect, and it is not something that is so subjective. I mean, 8 out of 10 people in that situation is going to say, when I try to sleep at night or try to go back to sleep at night, this thing is bothering me. So it's a bit more objective than we might think.
Let me ask a question that came in here, and just for everybody to know, don't write any more questions. I have 2 hours worth here, which is great. Thank you very much. This was written for Suzanne and John, but anybody could respond to it. Was any attempt made to do detailed surveys and focus groups to understand the attitudes of those people whose opinions switched after the project was built, either because it was more positive than they thought or more negative than they thought? Was there any attempt to do any detailed focus groups of those sorts of people? And then I have a question for everybody following up on that. Do you think those sorts of focus groups would be a good idea to get a better sense of how to understand pre-construction public opinion versus post-construction public opinion?
I'll go first. We did not conduct a post-construction survey, so I can't answer that piece of the question yet. We did, however, go out in early 2003 and identify, it's clear in our mind that we're going to impact the community that these turbines are located in. And so we identified 25 neighbors that we felt had the most to lose. They're going to see it more than most other folks in our community. They're going to possibly hear it. They might have the shadow issue. They might, whatever issue it might be, So within I think it was a mile radius, we sent out a survey crew to say, let's ask some questions of these folks. Are they supportive? Are they not? Are they have concerns? But we have not followed up with a post study yet.
It was really important to the community members that both the original vote in 2008 and the survey that was sent around last year, that the responses be anonymous. And so we have not been able to draw any sort of direct correlation between pre and post. Although we have heard some folks say in the newspapers and whatnot that they had originally been supportive and now they're not. So I think that they would count in the 5%, and they sort of self-identify themselves as being supportive originally.
And what is anybody, Dylan?
Well, I think that obviously those are the very real circumstances of people having concerns they didn't have post-construction. I think the larger trend of communities is of greater acceptance post-construction. And the obvious exception to that may be, in some cases, folks that are relatively close with noise. But, that's not the only issue that matters to the public. And certainly in Maine, again, where in many cases there are larger distances involved, it may not, in fact, be the most important issue. And so I think that our general experience is that post-construction public acceptance goes up a little bit as people just realize there's not that big a deal. And so I think that's been the case in a couple of places, and I think that may continue to happen in Maine.
In Falmouth, there has been post-construction brought about because of the problems. The town has done a pretty good job with surveys, with having a website that you can send information in. I think post-construction monitoring is something that ought to be covered in a granted special permit so that we can measure actual experience against some standards that get adopted and put right into that special permit. There can even be permanent monitoring stations, which are not that expensive, so that you can continue to track. So as part of a special permit process, which again I think no municipality should ever skip, you can do pre-construction testing and have peer reviewers, but then post-construction monitoring I think is critical.
Can I just add to that? I want to echo that. Post-construction monitoring on a number of different issues is really important, and we see in Maine in sort of the next generation of sets of projects, whether it's on wildlife or on did it actually produce electricity and displace other sources, or is it just a scam, and didn't it for tax purposes, noise. I think post-construction monitoring and then the dissemination in understandable terms to the public is really going to be important in our state, and I suspect elsewhere, because the question for the public comes down in a lot of cases to who do I trust and what information do I trust, and the developer says, yeah, this is going to produce this much electricity, or no, you're not going to hear it very much. And it's very important to be able to say, well, the project that we built, we've been monitoring for a year or two, and this is what we found. So I think that's really going to be the key going forward, is doing post-construction monitoring for a different set of different issues, including noise, and then reporting that out to the public so that they get a sense of sort of the reality on the ground that they can trust.
Good. I want to preface a question from the audience here with a story. I was in Wisconsin and visiting somebody who lives off the grid and whose house is powered with an old, very noisy, small wind turbine. And I said to her when I was there, "Doesn't the noise bother you?" And she said, "No, because every time I hear that noise, I hear the money I'm saving, and the noise means I'm saving money." Well, so here's the question someone had. How often do projects try to buy support from neighbors, such as providing free electricity? And do you think that's a good idea for projects to try to buy support in that way, or is that inappropriate?
Well, I'll jump in on that, because certainly a couple of the projects in Maine have suggested that as part of their benefits to communities, which come in different forms, taxation, that they would pay into a fund that would pay for electricity. And I have a little bit of mixed feelings about that, but I want to point out one of the differences we've noted here on the panel and across this landscape is that you have differences of municipal-owned utilities and investor-owned utilities. And in a municipal-owned utility, such as in Princeton or Fox Island, the people in the community are the ratepayers who get a direct financial benefit from that. And that's why they do that. And I don't think anyone in the room would suggest that's not a good idea. Those ratepayers are the ones that want to build, a wind project. Well, in larger utilities, in Maine, the investor-owned utilities, you can't really do that. The electricity goes onto the grid. We believe there's a good case for it having a benefit to ratepayers largely, but the community's not going to see that electricity. They're not going to see that price benefit directly. And so developers have suggested the shorthand, which says, that's not the way the grid works, guys, but we're happy to help reduce your electricity rates. Now, is that buying off public support? I don't have an answer to whether that's not acceptable. I think the communities are in the position to decide whether or not that's a good idea or not. But I think that comes about when it's hard, when you don't have a municipal-owned utility, to have a ratepayer benefit from wind power.
Chris?
I think we should never do that. I think we should never have waivers where people are approached to sell away their rights to complain if it's too loud. And I think the general public should benefit from the electricity generated. I think that when you go to your neighbors and you promise the electricity in a quid pro quo for support or non-opposition, not only before it's permitted but after, you complicate the entire land use system, which is based on a municipality making the best decision it can on what's appropriate land use in a different location. And post-development, there are processes where people come to town hall to complain that this turned out to be a nuisance or it turned out to be distressing. And then you're going to have meetings at town hall where someone stands up and says, that gentleman really shouldn't speak because he agreed not to, because he's getting a lower rate on his electricity, or he paid a waiver. I think it complicates the land use process, and land use goes on forever. Once a project is permitted, the special permit can be modified and it can be enforced. You've got zoning enforcement officers that have a big job ahead of themselves, especially with something that's very tall and has moving parts. So my own personal view as a land use attorney is that I don't support either waivers or these quid pro quo benefits.
Well, can I just add to that I think there's a lot of sense to those comments. I don't think that in Maine that these arrangements have been of that kind of a waiver of rights or a quid pro quo. They come in the context of a developer suggesting part of what they're doing. They're providing those benefits or proposing to provide them to all people in town, regardless of what they say. They're not waiving their rights. It may be part of a package that's suggested to the municipality that does have the effect and is intended to have the effect of increasing support. But I think it is possible in some of these cases that it is not a waiver of anybody's rights.
John, are you doing anything to mitigate flicker for residents? Or is that not an issue perceived by the residents?
Our flicker studies showed that there wasn't a large issue, but we did find that I think it was 36 minutes per year there might be flicker at one residence, given all the criteria that would exist. Sun in the right direction, no foliage, no trees, no cover, a whole bunch of other assumptions that made it the worst case scenario. So we told the site plan review, which is our planning board, that we would curtail operation during that 36-minute period of time per year, because it was pretty predictable. Low angle sun, fall and winter months, and if we thought that there was a problem, we'd just curtail operation. And we did the same thing with bird migration in the first 2 weeks of October with the help of Hawkwatch. We could curtail operation during that period as well in order to mitigate impact.
Okay. And Dylan, is wind power viewed as a means of displacing dams that generate power, thereby clearing rivers for fish and, sorry, I can't read the rest, but in terms of hydro, and how does Maine view biomass as a source of energy in relationship to wind?
Oh, that's a lot there. I'm trying to be really brief. Maine uses quite a lot of hydropower and a lot of biomass, generates a lot of biomass electricity, both at sort of standalone generators and in the pulp and paper industry, of which we have still quite a lot left that generate their own power. I would say no. We don't believe wind power is a substitute or replacement for those sources of electricity. Every source of electricity has significant environmental trade-offs. And hydropower, those certainly relate to changing of watersheds and sometimes can be quite negative on watersheds. Biomass has significant air quality issues, and we think carbon dioxide issues as well. And that's obviously a whole nother conference. But we think that the importance and the value of wind power is in displacing fossil fuel generation in the state and the region.
Okay. Do any of you have experience, and I will expand this, experience or know of other situations where professional neutral facilitators or mediators were used in relationship to wind siting? And if so, was it helpful? And if you don't have experience and know about it, do you think it's a good idea? Anybody have a comment? Chris?
Well, if we're talking about the local municipal land use process, I think this is a process that works very well and has since the 1920s when we created zoning. And I've done this for 30 years, and I have a lot of faith in the lay boards who volunteer in their towns to be on a zoning board of appeals or planning board. I think in most cases, as long as we respect the open meeting laws and we allow robust public hearings, a wind turbine application shouldn't really need to have an outside mediator. That process is really very trustworthy. In Falmouth, some groups have been brought in to try to help, but that's a very unique case where we find ourselves in this situation and we really must find an end solution, and I believe we will. But generally, if we allow land use to work the way it should, you shouldn't need that.
Anybody have other things you want to say on that? Okay.
I would agree with the previous statements. The site plan review process does allow or makes the developer, in our case us, the light department, bring in those experts to answer the questions brought out by the public. And I think that the site plan review through the planning board is the appropriate tool for that, just like it was mentioned.
Okay, good. What about the ethics of siting wind turbines? Why are not the adverse health effects addressed before wind turbines are sited?
Well, I'll chime in first. I mean, I think we talked about that a little bit in terms of noise, and I I think that it is increasingly being raised up front, and we have increasingly a set of experts that are being called in, and I like to think that our standards and our approach to noise issues is maturing and getting better. In terms of what is an adverse health impact, presumably that's referring largely to noise, and I agree with Chris that there's definitely noises that can bother people and have adverse health effects. If you hear a low thumping sound and you can't sleep enough of the time, that's going to be a problem. I generally don't think that there's a lot of evidence for other kinds of adverse health effects of vibrations that you can't hear, or other kinds of impacts that science has not yet identified. I think that tends to get people really worried, when in fact I think that it's pretty simple noise. I mean, it's noise you can hear, and if it's too loud, you're too close, and it's a pattern that is bothersome, then that's going to be a problem. It's not some sort of mysterious other health impact from wind power that we're dealing with. And so I think the regulatory process that's focused on decibel levels is appropriate.
When you talk about setbacks from turbines, is it a setback from a property line or from a dwelling? And if it's from a dwelling, why? Shouldn't people be able to enjoy their entire property? Chris?
With the new minimum performance standards that were adopted by the Cape Cod Commission, it's from the property line. And in the town of Bourne, which just adopted a new zoning bylaw, it's from the property line of any residentially used or zoned parcel. So I would agree with the questioner that if we're going to design a setback, we really ought to measure it at the property line.
Anybody want to say anything more on that?
I'd just echo that it's similar in Maine, so that it's to the property line unless the house is a significant distance from that property line, then it's the house.
Okay, good. And here's a question for Chris. How is the conflict of interest for a municipality any different for wind turbines than for a wastewater treatment plant? In both cases, the municipality is both the developer and the regulator.
Well, it's not different, but the use and structure is unique. And so we need to be extra careful because this has very elevated and very large moving parts. Almost anything else a municipality does, a police station, a school, a wastewater treatment plant, a water tower, either doesn't have moving parts that are elevated or is a building or is a lot where trucks are parked. And there are always impacts. If you build a new DPW station where you're going to store sand and have trucks, there may be concerns from the neighbors, but nothing like these wind turbines. In fact, in land use, there's never been anything like these wind turbines. So I'm not sure that the conflict of interest is any different. I just think the stakes are higher, and I think because wind energy is so politically correct and pushed very enthusiastically, and I am a supporter of wind energy. I tend to think that here in New England, with our population density, we should be shooting for some smaller turbines. But I think that it is very important that this conflict of interest be dealt with carefully because within every town, the expectations are very high that the town is going to make a lot of money. It is so politically correct to do this, which is true. So it's not a different conflict of interest. It's just the stakes are very high.
Good. I'm going to ask the panelists 2 more questions that you folks submitted, and then I'm going to give each panelist 2 minutes to say anything else they want to say that they haven't had a chance to say that they think is worth putting on the table. Okay, the next question is, does the term public good vary from state to state? Is there a definition? And if there isn't, would it be useful for there to be a definition? Anybody have anything you want to say on that?
You're the expert.
That's a tough one. Public good? Yeah, in a minute. I don't know. I'm not a lawyer, so I can't give a very legal answer to that question. But this does go to certainly the heart of wind power, is that where we get our energy from is very tied up into the public good. We need electricity to maintain our economy, our lifestyle, our hospitals. We need it. And so where does it come from is really quite important, because the impacts of the choices for where we get our electricity come from have broad public impacts. And choosing among those sources to minimize the breadth of public impacts is about figuring out the best for the public good. And I'm not really sure why that would vary tremendously from place to place.
Chris.
I'll just comment quickly. I do agree that finding the best possible set of renewable resources is in the public good. I think often in land use we are balancing something for the public good with private property rights. Mm-hmm. And we also we want to keep in mind that we really don't want to infringe on the right to use and enjoy one's property. In many cases, it's a family's most valuable asset, and it's where they live. And in many land use cases, neighborhoods have to just accept a new structure or use that they might not want to. But here we're dealing with a real friction point, where we're talking about real ability to use and enjoy one's property, and it needs to be balanced with that public good.
Good. The last question I'm going to ask here is for John, and it has to do with the original old wind turbines that were on the site. Was there any evidence after those turbines were built that property values for nearby houses were negatively affected by the turbines? And I'll add a second part to that. If that was the case, is there a sense now that you have two somewhat less intrusive turbines in some ways there for some of the properties, do you, maybe not for all, will property values change there?
With the original wind turbines, they were relatively small. They were on 100-foot towers. And so the terrain, again, and the foliage cover really masked their view from most of the properties around us. So I had no known instances where a house hadn't sold. We had no studies performed to verify that, but no concerns from our ratepayers, my neighbors, about the turbines sited in their neighborhood on the original installation. On the new installation, we've had some concerns from residents that were going to buy property. They asked me, if I buy this property, how close am I? Did your noise study pick up this or that on that property? And in the one or two instances that came up, we said no, and the property was sold and purchased by that person.
Okay, thanks. So the last thing we're going to do here is give each speaker up to 2 minutes to say anything else you want to say, and who'd like to go first? Dylan, I was...
Okay. Well, picking up on that last sort of question about public good, I really agree that wind power is about doing some balancing. And it's often balancing that's not easy to do. And at my organization, we struggle with that balancing in the way we see the world, which is as an environmental group. And we are often, when it boils down to it, balancing a broad public good that is very real with potentially minorities in communities who have a very real stake, but in many cases are minorities, and it's not just a minority potentially of people who live close, but a minority of people who have an opinion. And it's not always a minority, but I find in many cases in Maine, opponents of projects are generally minorities, and in some cases they have real reasons to have concerns. So how do you balance that broader public good against not doing undue harm to those minorities? That's a real question. I think doing that requires good information. It requires being honest about what our concerns are, not inventing concerns, but being honest about what our concerns are, and then being honest about the information that helps us understand whether those concerns are going to materialize. And that's all a lot of work, takes a lot of time, is very much worth doing. If we allow information that's not, grounded in science and evidence to prevent us from developing renewable energy on a large scale, then we're in a lot of trouble. So we have to really pay attention to doing that balancing as well as we can, and protecting the rights of minorities as best we can with good information, but we have to go forward and find a way to do that.
Good. Chris.
Thank you. Warren, thanks very much. And I appreciate being a part of this panel. By and large, you probably can tell I like the land use process. I've been doing it for 30 years, and the moment I don't find pleasure standing in front of zoning boards and planning boards at 9 and 10 o'clock at night, I will stop doing it. But I have loved it, and I think the process works. In all of the towns where the developer of the proposed wind turbines has been a private entity, it is working. The meetings are good quality meetings. The boards are doing their job. It may be taking longer than you want. The state may be feeling the pressure to get more and more of these rated megawatts up, but please give the regular land use process more time. You will see that we will get more wind, and I am an advocate for wind, solar, and geothermal here in New England. We have particular challenges where towns are wearing those two hats, but I think we will sort those things out. And I do hope that Massachusetts continues to regulate wind turbines with the land use system and does not follow the lead in some other states, including Connecticut and Vermont, where the siting decisions are largely turned over to the state. I think the local input is very, very important. I believe in the land use process, and if we all approach every single hearing in good faith and treat one another respectfully, the boards and commissions that are charged with this tough job will get that job done. Thanks.
Thanks. John.
Our project is basically this. It's sited in the environment that it's meant to protect, and that's kind of the stance that we took when we proposed it to our community. And we also, of course, presented that no project is perfect. It has a lot of trade-offs, just like was mentioned earlier, and that we have to balance those trade-offs, whether it's noise, visible, avian impact, you name it. We have to balance our power portfolio and our utility, and we did so with this power plant, and it is working for us economically. And that's a very important aspect from the municipal side that you don't probably hear too often. For a municipal light plant to purchase two turbines of this scale, it had to work economically, at least break even from what we could buy power otherwise. Otherwise, our ratepayers would be up in arms, and we wouldn't do the project in the first place. So for us, it works. It's in the environment that it protects, and it's a site that was well supported by our community, and you're more than welcome to come by and look at it and see for yourself.
Thank you. And Suzanne, last word.
Thanks, Warren, and thanks, Bob, for having us all here today. I think a couple of things I just wanted to sort of emphasize. Fox Islands Wind is a project of many firsts. It kind of has gotten old at a certain point in time for being the first to go through every single process we were going through, whether it be, the first project in the nation to combine tax equity financing with a low-interest rural utility loan, the first project to go through the Maine DEP small wind certification process, one of the first to deal with U.S. Fish and Wildlife on post-construction avian monitoring, the first to get certain certifications through the state. It's required us as a small community project with limited resources to really try to be innovative and to have a lot of patience. One of the things that I think that I'm most interested and excited about is the ability of the project to attract some really great resources to help us look at these challenges. And so, in particular, although we have folks with concerns about noise, we've been able to work with some great, an excellent team of researchers from the National Renewable Energy Lab and LBNL to talk to us about how we can really understand the bothersome qualities of the noise, their sources within the turbines, and potential ways of mitigation. So that's a study that's been going on for the last year or so. We'll have some interesting results from that this coming summer. We're talking with GE to try some blade treatments this summer to see if we can reduce the noise that way. and some other companies about using active noise cancellation technology to reduce the amount of sound from the turbines heard within homes. So I think that's the piece that gets left out a lot, is the fact that as a community owned project, a sort of public aspect to it, we're really reaching out to some really great resources. And I think what's really interesting for the folks that I work with on the islands is that so often Maine and the islands have been seen as sort of the end of the pipeline. And for once, you know, we've got the islands out in the front leading the way, and it doesn't mean that we haven't seen challenges, but I think that we all hope that we can better inform other communities and projects that come after us and continue to create the benefits that these communities very definitely need.
Great. Our panelists have been great. Let's give them a big round of applause. 15-minute break, and we'll be back here.